The Abraham Accords, A Step Toward Peace in the Middle East. Starring the Right Honorable Stephen Harper, the Honorable Meric Topolanik, the Honorable Ehud Barak, the Honorable Newt Gingrich. Moderated by the Honorable Hilik Barr, with guest speakers Dr. Nurit Hirschfeld, Dr. Thomas Walsh, Mr. Guy Taylor, and Dr. Michael Jenkins. And now, your host, Dr. Nurit Hirschfeld.
Respected current and former heads of state and government, members of the diplomatic corps, media, distinguished ambassador for peace, and our many friends and neighbors watching from around the world, welcome to the Abraham Accords, A Step Towards Peace. Thank you very much for your interest in this topic. This is one in a series of webinars sponsored by the Universal Peace Federation's International Council for Peace, which will examine constructive scenarios from the perspective of the major stakeholders in the Abraham Accords. Now, it is my great pleasure to invite Dr. Thomas Walsh, Chairman of UPF International, our host organization, to offer welcoming remarks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hirschfeld. It's a great pleasure. It's an honor to share a few words on behalf of Universal Peace Federation International, our founder, Dr. Hak Jahan Moon, our board of directors and ambassadors for peace. I want to first of all thank what has turned out to be an extremely distinguished group of panelists who will address our topic today. We're very, very grateful that they've joined this first in a series. We're honored to have them. This UPF webinar on the Abraham Accords will form the basis of a series of constructive, mutually respectful, virtual dialogues that explore steps forward that may enhance prospects for peace in the Middle East, a region of great significance to us all. I want to thank those who have invested so much time and energy in putting this program together. Dr. Jenkins and Hamad and Famularo, Mr. Brand, Jacques Marion, Dr. Hirschfeld, Hod Ben-Zvi, and others. I am very grateful that you've put together such a strong program. I believe our discussions today has potential to bear very good fruit and represents just the first step, the first stage of a wider dialogue aimed at contributing to improved understanding, mutual respect, and cooperation among all the core stakeholders in the region, including not only political leaders, but also representatives of civil society, faith-based organizations, and academia. As many of you know, UPF's brand and its method is to use multi-sectoral approaches to peace building, guided by principles of interdependence, mutual prosperity, universal values. Once again, my appreciation, my congratulations to all the panelists and the organizers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Walsh, for supporting the development of this series based on UPF's broad vision and purpose. Before we hear an overview of the Abraham Accords, I would like to briefly comment on the vision for peace in the Middle East from the standpoint of the Universal Peace Federation and ISCP, the International Summit Council for Peace, one of UPF's primary organizations. While all people in the Middle East hope to live in peace and prosperity, to realize this dream, we must face complex challenges that cannot be solved by one nation alone. Challenges including religious conflict, terrorism, corruption, desertification, poverty, to name just a few. While international diplomatic efforts toward peace are essential, UPF seeks to contribute its approach to conflict resolution based on a familial model that envisions humankind as one family under God. No matter how we choose our geopolitical orientation, all of us need to re-educate ourselves our children, and our communities to replace the cycles of offense and retaliation with forgiveness and reconciliation. Since 2003, UPF has conducted the Middle East Peace Initiative with dialogues and programs that bring together the leaders of the three Abrahamic religions and their communities. The ISCP serves as a platform for current and former heads of states and government to work cooperatively, applying their combined wisdom and experience in statecraft to the search for peaceful win-win solutions to our region's fundamental problems. Today's webinar represents the ISCP's vision in action. Sponsoring dialogue like this is what we do. The people at this table and those who will sit around the table in future panels can help us realize broader perspectives. We look forward to benefiting from what they have to say. And now, I have the pleasure of inviting Mr. Guy Taylor, Chief of the Washington Times International Security Team, to offer some historical context for the Abraham Accords.
It's frankly a tremendous honor to be a part of this program. It's an exciting moment that we're in. We've got a truly important discussion ahead here, and I'd like to offer my perspective as a Washington Times journalist with really the goal of putting some big picture historical as well as a bit of contemporary geopolitical context around the Abraham Accords, with an eye towards what's really at stake now as we go through a transition of power in Washington and as the incoming administration decides how to proceed or not proceed with them. There's definitely a bipartisan consensus in Washington that the Accords represent one of the biggest foreign policy achievements of the Trump administration. Even Joe Biden and Kamala Harris have praised the Accords. And the reason is because of how truly historic it has been that four major Arab powers have suddenly formally recognized the existence of Israel. To grasp the gravity of this, I think we've had to remind ourselves that these were actually the first such recognitions of Israel by Arab states since Jordan did so in 1994 and Egypt before that in the late 1970s. For me, it's a sobering reality that Arab countries, other than those two that share borders with Israel, have really throughout my professional career, really most of my lifetime, refused to even acknowledge Israel as a country. So the agreements with the UAE, Sudan, Morocco, Bahrain are really the most significant developments relating to Arab-Israeli relations since the 1993 Oslo Accords. But for deeper context, briefly here, let's consider a few questions and nuances. I think one of the biggest questions is why the Arab powers have been willing to recognize Israel now without the United States in return recognizing Palestine. I think that's a worthy question. Second is why Saudi Arabia has not yet joined the Accords and what may be needed to convince the Saudis to do so. Finally, I think there's a key nuance that so dramatically sets the Accords apart from the past, and that's the fact that the Trump administration broke with history by essentially putting aside long-standing disputes over the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in favor of instead convincing Arab leaders to focus on unifying with Israel around the grand regional security threat of mutual concern, and that's the threat posed by Iran. The relevance of this should not be understated because Joe Biden is coming to office signaling a desire to pursue rapprochement with Tehran. And the question now is how will that pursuit impact the Abraham Accords? Will it perhaps persuade or dissuade the Saudis from joining the Accords? And that's a big question since the Saudis stand against the idea of the U.S. rejoining the Iran nuclear deal. And really, in conclusion, I hope just in brief remarks here that I've done my duty as a journalist just by highlighting some of the big questions at hand. This is a really exciting moment, and I look forward to hearing the insights of some of the amazing participants we've gathered here today. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Taylor, for bringing us up to speed on today's topic. It is my great privilege to introduce to you the Honorable Felix Barr, who will present our distinguished panel and moderate the discussion. Mr. Barr served as the Deputy Speaker of Israel's Parliament, the Knesset, from 2013 to 2019. Previously, he served as Secretary General of the Israeli Labour Party and Jerusalem City Councillor. As a parliamentarian, he founded and chaired the caucus that works on resolving the Arab-Israeli conflict, the Two-State Solution Caucus. And now, I would like to give the floor to Mr. Barr, who is already implementing the peace accord and will moderate the session from Dubai.
Thank you so much, Nurit. Thank you so much, Dr. Hirschfeld, for your kind introduction. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Hello, leaders from many, many countries. And a special thank you for the UPF, which works nights and days, months and years for promoting peace, a word that is already forgotten in many, many places around the world. As you know, in Israel, we are longing for peace. We're working for peace. We're making efforts to live in a neighborhood which is sometimes problematic and not always easy for us, as probably we are not easy for some of them. And we have with us today world leaders, actually, 4 heads of states and Speaker Gingrich that will help us get a better perspective on the Abraham Accords happened in Israel a couple of months ago with a great excitement from all of us here. And I can testify, I'm here right now in Dubai in the last 2 weeks, and I'm witnessing myself the amazing outcome of the peace with the UAE. And I hope that we will have this peace with other nations as well. Today, we are lucky and pleased to have with us 4 keynote speakers that will join us in this session. The first is Right Honorable Stephen Harper, former Prime Minister of Canada. We have with us the Honorable Ehud Barak, former Prime Minister of Israel. We have the Honorable Meric Topolanik, former Prime Minister of the Czech Republic. And we're also fortunate to have the Honorable Newt Gingrich, former Speaker of the US House of Representatives. And these gentlemen at this panel each represent, of course, their own personal views, not the government's today. However, they have a huge experience, and we're so lucky that they will share it with us and will give us a little bit from their perspective. So to begin with, I would like to welcome the Right Honorable Stephen Harper, who served as Prime Minister of Canada from 2006 to 2015. I was lucky enough to see him speaking in the Knesset, our parliament, as a member of Knesset a few years ago. He served over 3 successive terms as Prime Minister. He put the Conservative Party on the map in Canada, and we will be so happy, Honorable Harper, to hear from you. It's good to have you here. You have now 3 minutes to have your opening remark. Honorable Harper, please.
Well, thank you, Speaker Barr, and my thanks also, as always, to Dr. Haq Jahan Moon and everyone at the Universal Peace Federation for making this webinar possible. We all know that we're in an extremely difficult period for humanity. For almost a year now, we've experienced the COVID-19 pandemic and the resulting recession. The costs around the world in terms of dollars and health have been extraordinary. But there is some good news in the world, and there is none better than what we have witnessed in the Middle East. There, as has been noted, nations that have been long and deeply divided have come together with the signing of the Abraham Accords, the State of Israel, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco. And in my view, Saudi Arabia, to answer Guy's question, Saudi Arabia is just a matter of time. This would not be happening without the Saudis, and I expect they will adhere when there is a change in the kingship there. I should mention that I recently returned from a business trip. I was in Dubai, Abu Dhabi, like Speaker Barr. I was on a trip to the UAE and Israel. I visited both countries on business many times, but this was the first time I was able to visit both on the same trip using the same passport. So that is an extraordinary change. And I found in both countries enormous positive energy and optimism around the new relationship. Why did this happen? I would argue that, first of all, the United States did 3 critical things. First, with the move of its embassy to Jerusalem, it removed all ambiguity about its support for Israel's permanence. Second, it took an unambiguous stand against the Iranian regime, which has already been noted, unites Israel and the Gulf Arabs around their most vital security interests. And third, it rejected the notion that the Palestinians have a veto over peace between Israel and other Arab nations. Now, for Israel, this is arguably its greatest diplomatic victory since 1948. And its government, I think, played the threat of West Bank annexation very shrewdly to get the deal over the finish line. Finally, the UAE was the country that made this most possible on the Arab side. And it did so by deliberately developing and propagating a tolerant version of Islam over many decades. And the UAE has been critical in framing this agreement not merely as a strategic alliance or as an economic opportunity, but as a reconciliation of faiths that others would seek to use for the purposes of division, hatred, and violence, and are actively doing so. Instead, in this case, these faiths have been framed as a human family, descended as they are from common roots, seeking reconciliation between the peoples of the earth and ultimately reconciliation between God and humanity. So from all standpoints, political, strategic, economic, and spiritual, the Abraham Accords are a tremendously hopeful achievement for the world during what has otherwise been a very difficult time. Thanks for having me, Speaker Barr.
Thank you so much, Honorable Mr. Harper. And I'm very proud to introduce our next speaker, which is the Honorable Ehud Barak, who served as Prime Minister of Israel from 1999 until 2001. Previously, he was the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Israel and the Minister of Defense of Israel. And of course, the most decorated soldier in Israel and the chief of the IDF. But you cannot compare any of that to his toughest mission, which was to be my boss for a few months when he was the chairman of the Labour Party and I was his Secretary General. So it is my great honor to invite Prime Minister Ehud Barak to give his opening remark. Ehud, please.
Thank you very much, Secretary General Barr. I think Abraham Accords are extremely important development. I served 45 years in uniform and then as the Minister of Defense. But I can tell you that we had never fought with any of these countries. But still, it is important. It legitimizes an array of relationship which were very lengthy on time and included a lot of cooperation. Some 42 years ago, as a ranking general, I visited the palace of King Hassan II in Morocco, discussing issues and advising them about the fight against the Polisario in the desert. 25 years ago, as a Minister of Foreign Affairs under Shimon Peres, we met the Prince of Bahrain and many of the other Arab leaders in Sharm el-Sheikh as part of the political process. And we had many meetings since then with ABZ, with Lotaibe, with Saudi kind of prominent figures and so on. Yet I should admit that it was moving to see these events in Washington where the accords were announced. The credit goes to President Trump, to MBZ, to Netanyahu, and to the people behind the scenes, Ambassador Lotaibe, Jared Kushner, and many others. The legitimacy is important for the world, for the region, and for the peoples. It shows that we can cooperate in the open on any area. There were, of course, many other background reasons and some other considerations, both political or economic. There are heavy contracts are waiting to the defense prime contractors in the United States. And it helped politically, it helped Netanyahu in a somewhat subtle or sensitive time. But these are all negligible effects compared to the impact of the achievement. We'll have embassies, we'll have tourism, but I should tell you that there were also unpredictable consequences. Some of the supporters of these agreements in Israel thought that it will block the way on any opportunity or possibility of relationship with the Palestinians. It will replace the Palestinian Authority. The opposite is happening. Israelis are admiring the achievements of the Emirates, the towers, the artificial islands, the ski site when it's 45 centigrades outside, or the Louvre. But when Israelis are asking for selfies with tourists from Dubai at the center of Tel Aviv, and it ended up that those tourists were basically youngsters from Israeli city, Kfar Qasem, of Arab city in Israel. And it kind of emphasized the fact that a millimeter under the skin, you cannot think of the Arabs as something kind of inferior type of citizens or neighbors when you are in such a intimate relationship with the Emirates and Bahrain or with Morocco. So in a sly way and an irony of history, in a way, the Abraham Accords, probably against the wishes of some of the originators, it will lead to breaking the ice with the Palestinians as well. I think that to summarize, these accords gives us, instead of the conflict and friction, it gives us both a future and a hope. And I used to say, even if it takes another 5, 15, or 50 years, at the end, we will settle our relationship with the neighbors. And once we settle it, few years later, people will look backward and could not understand why the hell it took us so many years, several generations, to find the obvious that we are neighbors, we are all normal people that can live side by side with mutual respect. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Prime Minister Barak. Our next guest is the Honorable Mirek Topolanik, who served as Prime Minister of the Czech Republic from 2006 to 2009. He has also been a member of the Parliament, the Chamber of Deputies, as well as the Senator. Welcome, Prime Minister Topolánek. We'll be happy to hear in 3 minutes your opening remarks.
Thanks, Speaker. Good morning or good afternoon, it depends. Dear friends, colleagues, participants in this significant panel, thanks for invitation. We discuss about the Abraham Accords declaration. Not coincidentally, the Accords are named symbolic after the patriarch Abraham, regarded as a prophet by both the religions of Judaism and Islam. Is it possible to fulfill these declared principles indeed? Must be, sure. I'm from Prague, from the Czech Republic. My country was relatively independent and free only 1/10 of the time during the last 400 years. And therefore, we are traditionally, and after the Velvet Revolution, unquestionably a friend and supporter of the State of Israel. On the other hand, we paradoxically use inherited communication with Arab states from the communist era. When I visited Jerusalem, the next day I was in Amman. After negotiations in Tel Aviv, I traveled to Ramallah, etc. It's true that communication, mutual benefit, and the bonus of states willing to cooperate are needed to resolve the situation in the Middle East. Hold balls with permanent pressure, defense of the vulnerable, and punishment of attackers and terrorists. We were and we are exceptional within the EU. The European Union is, and especially states with a growing Muslim minority, are now subject to anti-Semitism, clumsily hidden behind the fight against so-called Israeli aggression. EU is weak, hypocritical, disunit, and purposeful in business interests. The Abraham Accord Declaration and following or implied agreements are, at first, a victory for common sense and self-preservation instinct. Secondly, a response to the strengthening threats caused by the imperial games of Russia, Iran, and Turkey under the motto, "My enemy's enemy is at least a partner." Thirdly, pragmatic decision motivated by visible concession agreements or advantages. However, signature of AD is a real breakthrough in Middle Eastern relations with global consequences and undoubtedly the big success of Donald Trump's administration. It is questionable who was the founding father of these ideas and initiatives. The Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, advisors led by his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, doesn't matter. The important thing is that Trump approved and implemented them. The agreements of the normalization of relation between Israel and the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, and the promise of similar Israeli agreement with Sudan are completely groundbreaking, historically significant and lasting. However, Trump's successes in this area were fundamentally marked by his incitement to attack the Capitol on the last Wednesday as the culmination of his post-election behavior. Hopefully, perhaps Joe Biden will have the sense, courage, and strength to continue in this process. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Prime Minister Topolánek, for your words. And to conclude our opening remarks, I would be honored to welcome the Honorable Newt Gingrich, who served as the Speaker of the United States House of Representatives from 1995 to 1999. Speaker Gingrich is also a historian and a great thought leader. Speaker Gingrich, the floor is yours for your 3 minutes of opening remarks.
Well, thank you very much, and I want to build on what's just been said. I actually think this is a remarkable case study of three things. One, the Trump administration from the very beginning breaking with all of the traditional American diplomatic experts who had for 25 years said, until you solve the immediate Israeli-Palestinian problem, you can't solve anything else. What happened was the opposite. I think with Jared Kushner really at the center of this, they concluded, what if we were to solve the other problems and then be in a position of strength to come back and talk about the Israeli-Palestinian situation? The first indication of this was when the very first trip overseas by the newly elected President Trump was to Riyadh, where the Saudi king had assembled 54 countries, I think the largest Muslim collection ever to meet with an American president. And for 3 solid days, they met and they talked in general terms, driven largely by the threat of Iran, but also with a sense of what could we get done. So part one, I think, was this was a real break in the way in which America had perceived trying to solve the problem. Part two was to move to a moral framework. I think that's what's so important about the Abraham Accords, that they really do say, look, we historically are closer together. We are tribal brothers and sisters. We have much more reason to find a way to live together than to find a way to kill each other. And I think by putting it in that framework, so it wasn't just a geopolitical this week event, but it was a real effort to embed the pursuit of peace into a process that involved a great historic lineage, and which enabled us to come back to the whole question of religious liberty, which has been one of the biggest themes of the Trump administration. Third, I think you have to recognize the sheer success of Israel. As it grew steadily economically, as it grew steadily technologically, as its military became more and more capable of solving problems, most of its neighbors began to realize this was our strongest ally against a potential Iranian incursion. And it was a country not likely to go away. And so I think gradually we set the stage for what is truly a historic moment. And I really do hope that President Biden and his team will recognize they now have something they can build on, not something they can turn away from. And I hope that this particular conference was one step in that direction.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your kind words, Speaker Gingrich. And let's begin. Let's bring again all of our panelists back onto this virtual stage. Mr. Harper, Prime Minister Barak, Prime Minister Topolánek. We also welcome back Guy Taylor from the Washington Times. Now we will enter around 35-40 minutes of questions and discussion, more freely, less formal. Actually, some excellent questions have come in during the discussion from YouTube and by text. And I would like to begin with the question to Prime Minister Harper to respond the first question, and any of the other panelists that feel free to respond as well. Mr. Harper, you saw the Abraham Accords as a positive development. Given the coming changes in both administrations, will the accord stay on track? Is it stable or flexible, in your opinion?
Yeah, really good question. First of all, I'll just quarrel with the premise. Obviously, there will be a change in the administration in the United States. Whether there'll be a change in the administration of Israel is, of course, up to the electors of that country, and that decision hasn't been taken yet. And some of us may have different feelings about whether that should or should not happen. But I would say this. I
will just say that what I meant to say is not necessarily about Netanyahu, but it will be a different government. We are in election times. The formation of the government may be different, so I didn't imply necessarily to Netanyahu, but we will have a new government in.
Well, we always know Israel will have a new government, whatever year we're talking about. But look, I would say this. I actually don't think it's going to make a lot of difference. It's certainly going to make no difference on the Israeli side. As you know, Israelis are committed to this right across the political spectrum. As I think one of our panelists mentioned, I think it was Ehud, Prime Minister Barak. Israeli Arabs are quite positive. Even Israeli Arabs are quite positive in support of this agreement. So this is literally uniting across the spectrum in Israel. The question is in the United States. Obviously, Joe Biden has indicated support for the accords. I don't believe that he will do anything to deliberately undermine them. However, there is the possible agenda of reaching out to Iran. I actually don't think that's going to make a lot of difference one way or the other, although both Israel and the Gulf Arabs are opposed to such an initiative, and rightly so, I should add. The fact of the matter is that one of the reasons they've done this alliance is to be able to, within the region, resist Iranian expansionism and hegemony. They're not going to depend solely on the United States. So if the United States decides to go in that direction, I think, if anything, this just further solidifies the alliance that's taking place between Israel and the Gulf Arabs. So I hope the Biden administration doesn't go down that route. But if they do, I don't think it will weaken this new alliance and recognition of peace between these countries in any way.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much, Mr. Harper, Prime Minister Harper. I would like to ask the next question to Prime Minister Barak. Prime Minister Barak, having a first-hand experience negotiating with the Palestinians, in your opinion, should they be included in the Abraham Accords track that is developing these days, or should they dealt only bilaterally between Israel and the Palestinians, in your opinion?
No, I think that from a certain perspective, their very absence from the accord enabled their being signed by all partners. So they cannot be related to it directly. But as I have mentioned already, it will change the attitude of Israelis toward Arabs, not just Arabs in the Gulf, but Arabs in Israel and in the Palestinian Authority. Israel is used to or learned to look at the Arabs as traitors when they are Israeli citizens, and as a kind of existential threat if they are Palestinians. And neither of these opinions is true. The Arabs of Israel are basically 99.999% of them are honest citizens that think differently from many of us about the Palestinian issue, but they are good citizens, and the Palestinians cannot threaten Israel. It's ridiculous. Israel is perceived as a nuclear power, by far the strongest country, 1,000 miles around Jerusalem, and to talk about the Palestinians as an existential threat to Israel is somewhat grotesque. So, but in an indirect way, it pushes us one step toward resumption of negotiations with the Palestinians. Of course, the Palestinians might find a way to be solved probably in the Gulf between the Qataris and the others about the role of Hamas, because as of now, the Palestinian Authority doesn't control half of its own people. And I think that the Biden administration, together with the European Union, I think Biden will not intervene in the accords. He will bless them, and he will not go into conflict with Netanyahu about the past. I don't believe it. But they will take their position of the need to contact and need to negotiate with the Palestinians and need to see as a vision the two-state solution. And I believe that they will express it. They never used to hide their opinions. And probably it will lead to a second shot in Israel as well.
Thank you so much, Prime Minister Barak. The next question is to Prime Minister Topolánek. Prime Minister Topolánek, so far we have not seen an overly supportive response in Europe towards the accords. What is your advice in order to harness such support and to have more positive impact of the EU on the process?
I don't need 10 minutes. I don't know exactly. You know that there are not so many countries within the European Union all the time, or the last time, and supporting State Israel, supporting the process. I remember when Tony Blair was as a chief of the quartet, so-called quartet, and was responsible for some negotiations between Palestinian and Israel, but without visible success. I am afraid that especially Germany, especially France, maybe other countries are very, very careful and try to push through own interests within the region. All the time. On the last time they collaborating with Iran. I remember many machines and many equipments delivered to Iran against embargo, and I don't see some strong force, strong influence within the European Union to have a bigger influence to the Middle East region, and to have a bigger interest to solve anything, and to push positively to some visible success. Unfortunately, I don't have some better advice. In this time, the situation in the European Union is very fragile, very turbulent, and we try to solve our problems. And I'm afraid that I don't see some strong personality to push a big influence of European Union, big support to the region. Unfortunately.
Thank you. Well, you gave us an honest answer, and that's the best advice you can give, of course. Thank you so much, Prime Minister Topolánek. I want to address the next question to Honorable Newt Gingrich. Speaker Gingrich, the U.S. Trump administration had led an unprecedented process leading to 4 Arab nations involving in the accords with Israel. What, in your opinion, was the key to this huge success?
I think there were 3 steps. One was the rise of Iran as a genuine threat, which I think has led all of the Arab states, or at least the ones we're talking about, not counting Syria and Lebanon, but all the other Arab states to say, I think I'd much rather have some relationship with Israel as an insurance policy against Iran. And so I think that began to be a very serious consideration. Second, I think the very direct move of the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, just saying flatly, this is over, it's not negotiable, get it off the table. The United States stands with Israel and having the right to determine what its own capital is. And that, I think, communicated a sense of finality and toughness, because I actually authored the bill in 1996. And it had been signed with an agreement that each president could annually waive it and not implement it. And every president had until Trump. And Trump overrode his entire State Department bureaucracy and said baloney. But he could do it because he had been at Riyadh. He had a good relationship. He could call the Arab leaders directly and say, if I do this, how big a deal is it? And all of them said to him, frankly, compared to what we're doing to protect us from the Iranians, it ain't a big deal anymore. And then third, I think the fact that they were willing, case by case. I mean, look what they did with Morocco and the problems of the Polisario. Look what they've done with Sudan. In each case, you had an American administration willing to use its influence to get another step forward. And I suspect had he been reelected, they would have worked very hard to get the Saudis in and 2 or 3 other countries in to continue building the momentum. But even as it is now, it's a remarkable historic achievement.
Thank you so much, Honorable Newt Gingrich. I want to ask Prime Minister Harper, this peace didn't happen for 70 years. What, in your opinion, was the key factors that brought the nations together for the accords at this time?
I would just reiterate what I said in my opening remarks, and I think what Newt just said. A series of things: the rise of Iran, a U.S. administration that removed ambiguity about Israel's permanence. Frankly, if I can be blunt, this was one of the biggest mistakes of the West in the last 70 years, was not recognizing that Israel's capital was in Jerusalem, at least in West Jerusalem, that we always recognized as Israeli territory. So we ended that ambiguity. And then a number of measures, obviously, that the Trump administration took in terms of its bilateral relations, but most importantly, denying the Palestinians a veto over the process, because they've adopted, for 70 years, a historic position of refusal. Like, I would just add, though, I think what's happened in the United Arab Emirates is very important as well. They really do. I've spent a lot of time with senior Emirati leadership over the past number of years. They are committed to developing a modern, religiously tolerant, and even pluralistic society. They want this relationship not just for the economic and strategic value, but they want to continue the transformation of their society so they can be part of the modern world. They are the extreme opposite vision of an Iran. And for them, this is a Rubicon they've crossed, and they're not going back, and it's a direction they're taking their society in longer term.
Thank you so much, Prime Minister Harper. I would like to ask Prime Minister Barak, what do you see as the most important outcome of the Abraham Accords? And also, if I may ask, do you see the Arab partners now helping to expand normalization to other countries and economic trade with Israel? And also, you touched it a little bit, but maybe you'll elaborate. Also, will it contribute to the two-state solution? You are one of the advocates for the two-state solution. Will it help?
Well, first of all, to share with you my impression that we, as members of the world leadership, are lucky to have leaders like the Honorable Harper and Speaker Gingrich and Prime Minister Topolánek as world leaders and world opinion kind of molders, and as friends of Israel. If more leaders in the last generation would have listened to what you thought, expressed, acted upon, and even telling us now, probably many of the troubles of the Middle East would have been solved before the consequences are buried 6 feet under. So we are lucky to have you, and I wish you all the energy and the focus to continue this fight for what's good, not for Israel, it's good for the world, but it happened to be supporting or giving Israel positions a tailwind. I think the most important element is the future of spreading it further beyond the present group. Speaker Gingrich mentioned the 54 Muslim countries. We have quite good relation underneath the surface with many of them, and the more of them coming to legitimize, the more others joining, it will normalize. We have a territorial conflict with the Palestinians, our neighbors, which we have to be solved, preferably through negotiation rather than to arm twisting and use of force. But we don't have any conflict with the Muslim world. It's 1.5 billion people, and in a way, the civilization, the Islam civilization, as well as the Christian one, was kind of born out of the great Judaism kind of tradition. They have their own role, much wider on the world. We have a national top level interest not to turn our territorial conflict with the Palestinians into a struggle with the Islam as a faith or as a civilization. And the two-state solution, I believe that we have to stick to this idea of separating ourselves from the Palestinians to delineate within the holy promised land line within which we will have a solid Jewish majority for generations to come, and all our security interests included in it, and still leaving a space on the other side of this border for a viable, demilitarized Palestinian state that could kind of flower side by side with Israel. And in this regard, I think that, once again, as both, Prime Minister Harper and Speaker Gingrich mentioned, in a way, history made a turnaround, a kind of detour. And instead of following the great legacy of so many generations of the State Department or American president, that we first have to solve it through the Palestinians, founded another way. Let's create a situation where the Emirates and the other partners for these Abraham Accords will have both leverage against Israel, telling them, we ask you to find a reasonable solution with Palestinians based on two states, which they basically say, and something to lose if it doesn't take off. And the same happens with Israel. We found that we signed agreements. It will enrich and be benefit for both sides, but somehow it gives Israel make Israel more exposed to kind of pressure from the Arab world to solve with the Palestinians as well, and something to lose if it doesn't happen. So all in all, it's positive from whatever way you look into it.
Thank you so much, Prime Minister Barak. I would like to address the next question to Prime Minister Topolánek. Prime Minister Topolánek, under your leadership, the Czech Republic was president of the EU Council, and you were a good negotiator between Ukraine and Russia, as well as a positive negotiation even in Gaza. What is your advice to ensure a continuous positive development on the accords?
It's a good question. We have to know that without very strong support of Angela Merkel, I wouldn't be able to be so strong and so influential in this crisis, not only in gas crisis between Ukraine and Russia, but at the same time was a crisis in Gaza. And I was a participant of the summit in Sharm el-Sheikh, and discussion between leaders of European Union and leaders from Arabic countries and Ban Ki-moon and so on. I think we have to be patient at first. Secondly, and I try to explain during my first expression, first presentation, we have to use some soft and some hard tools. Soft tools are money, advantages, some help for countries willing to accept this process, this normalization process within the region, and hard power and hard tools to criminalize, to fight against attackers, terrorists, and countries not willing to accept some peaceful process. I think it is a question for the next American or US administration to keep the positive approach and positive steps realized during the last mandate of Donald Trump, to keep it and to continue, and to use some lines or connections, natural connections, which will potentially keep this new normalization process done by business, tourism, and very simple values starting this process and keeping this process. Maybe it will be very interesting now to look at Jordan and Egypt and the agreements signed in the past. The approach of these countries, from this cold peace to maybe warmer peace and better cooperation, it will be very interesting. But I'm a little bit afraid of the in this transition period between the Trump's and Biden's administration, will Palestinian resistance and very low day and will be renewed. And I am afraid a little bit of the re-agreements and the renewing of cooperation with Iran and some effort to sign some new agreement. It is my big fear, and I have to come back to my first word: patience. Patience is very, very important within this region.
Prime Minister Topolánek, thank you so much. And I want my next question to Honorable Newt Gingrich. You are a well-known politician, but you are also the husband of the U.S. ambassador to the Vatican, and you are a man of faith. And actually, we have more than 400 leaders from all around the world with us, not only political leaders, but also religious leaders. So in your opinion, Speaker Gingrich, what role would you recommend for the religious leadership in opening the way to more progress in peace in the region?
Well, first of all, it's a great question, and one which my wife, Calista, and I have talked about a lot, and I've watched developments here in Rome over the last 4 years. I think that's part of why I mentioned earlier that the Abrahamic Accords provided a moral and historic framework for coming together by emphasizing literally the brotherhood of both the Jewish and Muslim backgrounds, and of course, Christianity through Judaism. And so I think it puts a different flavor, a different overview than just a normal secular political agreement. I also think in the times that we have been, for example, in Abu Dhabi and have gone to Mass with some 800 people, it's very important, as Prime Minister Harper said, that you see there in the UAE a very serious effort to find a way to create greater openness. And frankly, from a Christian perspective, it would be helpful on occasion if the Israeli government were a little more open, because at times it gets a little strict, and there are various minor skirmishes that are not particularly productive. But I do think, to the degree that the three great monotheistic religions can talk with each other, it changes the environment and it changes the context. I also think it's very important to recognize that what happened, both because of enormous effort by Israel to become a truly modern, technologically advanced country, and because of the Trump administration's determination that the embassy should be in West Jerusalem, and the signal that sent to the Palestinians essentially was you can no longer provide a veto on history. If you want to sit this out, that's fine, but other things are going to happen around you, and you, in fact, are going to become more and more isolated and less relevant. The other thing I think that was important, and I'd love to hear some comments from our European friends on this, by having more countries, if you will, more frontline countries, recognize Israel and the kind of tourism that's growing up very rapidly with the UAE and other things that are going on, I think it makes it a little harder for the left, both in America and in Europe, to be holier than thou. I mean, if in fact Morocco, Sudan, UAE, Bahrain are all willing to work with Israel, then along with, of course, Jordan and Egypt, then it gets a little trickier, I think, for Westerners to decide that somehow they have a superior insight into the region than the people who are the neighborhood. I think that could be a very major side effect of these agreements.
Thank you so much, Speaker Gingrich. And now since all of you answered two questions, I will throw a question to the stage. And if one of you would like to take that, we will be very happy. Of course, we also have with us Guy Taylor from the Washington Times that is more than welcome to reply. Do you see the Saudi Arabia joining, and what actually, to your opinion, are the next nations that will possibly join?
So I'll grab that. I think I already, Speaker Barr, I already mentioned this. As we all know, Prime Minister Netanyahu recently had a trip to Riyadh, and so obviously those lines of communication are open. At the same time, the foreign policies of the Saudis, the Emiratis, and the Bahrainis are very closely coordinated. In my judgment, and based on discussions I've had in the region, I think it's impossible to believe that this accord would have happened without at least tacit, if not pretty open, Saudi approval. And Saudi spokespeople have been out criticizing with new, very unique and new criticism of Palestinian intransigence, and very supportive of this direction. As I say, I believe the fundamental reason that the Saudis haven't adhered yet is this will be a more difficult transition for them. Unlike, the Emiratis, they have not taken decades moving their public towards a much more moderate and tolerant version of Islam. This is something that has only begun recently with the ascent to power of Mohammed bin Salman as crown prince. And my anticipation is that when he ultimately becomes king, and it's hard for me to see how that won't happen in due course, that you will ultimately see the Saudis become part of this. And that's the big one. Other than the countries that are influenced by Iran, Lebanon, Syria, and to some degree the Qataris, I think you are going to see now the Arab world shift in this direction permanently, unless there were to be a curveball that blew this relationship apart. I think this now has a momentum that's kind of unstoppable, and there's younger generations that don't want a part of the conflict of the past 75 years.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. And another question I would like to throw to the air is, which one of you, what do you want to recommend to President-elect Biden as to whether he should build on the Abraham Accords?
I can answer for sure, but I would advise him to hug it, to give a compliment to his opponent. He defeated him. It doesn't mean that he has to try to erase any positive step that he has done. In a way, it will give him more credit in a way if he would be able to see through the political rivalry the fact that several important steps had happened under Trump for whatever reasons. And I think that we should encourage him. In fact, I think, I happen to know Blinken and many other people there. They are very reasonable. very balanced people, highly experienced because of their experience under the Obama. They have different positions, many issues in earth than the Trump administration, but not on this issue. There's no reason for this. Would be a launching pad for continuation.
Thank you, Prime Minister Barak. And maybe the last question that we can throw to the panelists. What are the possible impediments you see to the continuous process of the Accords, and how can we overcome them? Are they obstacles that we should be looking forward to see? Oh, everything is perfect, as I understand.
Sure, I'll go if I have
Anyone?
To here.
Yeah,
Yes.
We have 2 minutes.
I'm happy to take this question if I have an opportunity to. I think what we're grappling with, and I don't want to take up the entire 2 minutes, so I'll be very brief. I think what we're grappling with, and I think Speaker Gingrich and Prime Minister Harper hit on it, is whether or not the Accords actually signal this shift in grand pan-Arab geopolitical thinking away from an era when the plethora of Arab powers viewed, or at least perpetuated, the idea that they viewed the pursuit of Palestinian statehood, and particularly Palestinian control over Jerusalem, or part of Jerusalem, specifically the Al-Aqsa Mosque, one of Islam's holy sites, as really like this linchpin of their collective national interests. And I think that's what Biden's team is going to have to look at. And when they go out and shake hands with the people that the Trump team has been working with, they've got to have an open mind to the possibility that shift has happened. And how are they going to work with it? That's one observation. Hopefully it gets a final answer out of our other esteemed panelists here.
Look, I would just comment quickly, and as you know, I'm a very strong supporter of Israel. I do think, all sides have to make this work. And, there could be external conflict that could upset this process. I doubt it. There also could be internal developments in Israel. I think would be very, very important now that, nothing happen in Israel that looks to the other Arabs like it would be sabotage of the possibility of a long-run peace between Israelis and Palestinians. I don't expect that will happen, but there are those risks that exist in Israeli politics.
Thank you, Prime Minister Harper. Thank you, Guy Taylor from the Washington Times, for your remarks. Ladies and gentlemen, we will need to wrap this up this portion in order to give each of our panelists 2 minutes to offer us with his final thoughts. So we'll begin this time with Speaker Newt Gingrich. Speaker Gingrich, the floor is yours. 2 minutes, final thoughts.
Well, thank you. I thought this was a very interesting discussion with some pretty fascinating and very, very experienced panelists. I think the key is for everybody to move forward, not just to wait passively and hope that the Biden administration does the right thing or hope that the Europeans come around, but rather the more Israel can expand tourism, education, medical circumstances, the more interaction there can be at the personal level, at the non-governmental institutional levels. So you begin to build real networks of relationships. I think the better off we're going to be and the faster the region is going to evolve. I was very struck with the sheer wave of Israeli tourists who went to the UAE in the first week or two, that both had to be economically good for the UAE, but also had a bit of a culture shock on both sides. But I think rather than waiting for the politicians, the opportunity's now been created for people to really dramatically interact with each other, reach out to each other, create relationships. And I think that the more Israelis can interact with Sudanese or Moroccans or people from the various Gulf states, the better off. And the more that'll then send a signal to other countries, why don't you want to become a part of this? And I actually think it may turn out to be a remarkable breakthrough that 5 or 10 years from now, Prime Minister Ehud Barak said earlier, people will look back eventually and think, why did that take so long? Because once it actually happens, it's going to look like it was the obvious natural thing to have happened. So I'm very encouraged. I think the Biden administration, while they may adopt some policies I disagree with on Iran, I have a hunch they're going to continue down this road and try to learn from it and try to continue to grow it rather than break it up.
Thank you so much, Speaker Gingrich. And now we'll hear from Prime Minister Topolanek. Please.
Thank you.
Prime Minister, thoughts.
At first, once more, I have to thank the organizers, the UPF, to organize this significant panel. It's a great job, and thank you very much, and thank you for invitation. I have maybe one recommendation and one wish. The recommendation to new U.S. administration, Biden administration. I understand as a former politician after the elections to be strong and to criticize everything before me. But on the other hand, I can recommend to Biden's administration to criticize, but to keep positions and to continue this process, because it is very important, not only for US, it is important for the whole world. And the wish, I wish ourselves, participants and people, former politicians active in some public life and in some foundations and so on, to use our influence, because we are not powerful, we are not in power now, but we are influential, and when we will be able to merge, to connect, and to have a common voice, very strong voice, we can help this process and we can help continuation of this process. This is my wish. I wish you good health for everybody, and next time. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Prime Minister Topolánek. And now we will hear from Prime Minister Ehud Barak, his 2 minutes of final thoughts. Prime Minister Barak, please.
I first of all want to thank once again our colleagues participating and wish them to remain raising their voice. They are important political and thought leaders, both Prime Minister Topolánek and Prime Minister Harper and Speaker Newt Gingrich and Guy Taylor with us, and even Secretary General, former Speaker Hilik Barr. Raise your voice. It is heard. Sometimes you feel that it doesn't influence, nothing happen. It is there, it gradually influences. And I can wish all of us, we're at the opening of a new year, that we'll have a better year than the previous one. Bearing in mind what happened during the last year, it's not a hard demand on the Almighty to make it better than the previous one. And in regard to Abraham Accords, I think it opened huge opportunities. I'm hard-headed optimist, and I can only hope that the present leaders of the world will have enough kind of inspiration, enough sense of direction, leadership and political will, and more than anything else, common sense to use these opportunities.
Amen to that. Thank you, Prime Minister Barak. And now we will hear the final thoughts from Prime Minister Harper. Prime Minister Harper, the floor is yours.
Great. I think we all agree, as does most of the world, that this has been an extremely positive development. So let me just take my closing comments to address the two big unresolved questions. One is obviously ultimate peace between Israelis and Palestinians and a two-state solution. The Palestinians have, for 70-some years, taken the position that they could somehow, by resisting the existence of Israel, get themselves the ideal deal. One would hope that it becomes now apparent to them that they've lost all their important allies in the Arab world in trying to do that, and that it makes far more sense to reach out to Israel, to actually go to the negotiating table and come to a settlement. And when they do that, I think they will find that these accords, which now give the key Arab nations a voice very close to Israel, will actually help them in reaching a constructive solution to this long-term problem. The other issue that has to be addressed is Iran. You know, as we've all noted, it's interesting to see peace increasingly happening or about to happen between Israel and Arab nations. So why is Iran, which has frankly no long-term stake in this, why is Iran the actor trying to create war? That tells you a lot about the malevolence of that regime. And I hope the Biden administration does not take the pressure off of Iran, because Iran is really on its back foot right now. But if they are to enter into negotiations with Iran, let's hope that it's not narrowly around the technical issues of nuclear weapons capacity development, because that is only a manifestation of Iran's malevolence in the region. Such negotiations have to address its role and its ongoing fostering of hatred and division in countries that it frankly has no business intervening in the first place. So I think those are the two issues ahead of us. I want to thank everybody once again. Thanks to the Universal Peace Federation, as always, to Thomas and to Nuret and Guy, and of course, thank you, Speaker Barr, for your very professional mediation of this discussion.
Thank you so much, Mr. Harper, and it will be my great honor to actually thank our four panelists. Don't go anywhere yet. Prime Minister Harper, Prime Minister Barak, Prime Minister Topolánek, and Speaker Gingrich. And in closing, I would like to say really that since its inceptions, UPF, as most of you said, through its MEPI and with strong encouragement from the founders, has been committed to promoting dialogue for the sake of peace in the region, guided by principle of interdependence, mutual prosperity, and universal values. UPF has a unique multi-sectoral approach that highlights the need for all the important stakeholders to have a place at the table and to share their insights, including not only political leaders and diplomats, but also representative of civil society, BOs, business, media, academic, religious, and arts. The pursuits of peace must be widely collaborative across a wide range of sectors and cutting across the ideological divides. We look forward to future occasions to come together. This concludes our discussion of the Abraham Accords for now. But before we leave, I would like to invite Dr. Michael Jenkins, my friend, president of UPF International, to offer some closing remarks. Dr. Jenkins, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Speaker Barr, and thank you to all our distinguished panelists for an excellent program. I give special thanks to all of you for engaging in this effort to bring peace in the Middle East and around the world. I just received a note that very distinguished leaders have been watching us from all over the world. There are a number of current members of parliament from many countries, including Canada. We have the UAE ambassador with us, former Prime Minister of Ireland, and many others. We welcome all of our global audience. Our next program on the Abraham Accords will most likely take place in March, for which we expect to host the key leaders of the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco. Already there have been very positive responses. Eventually, we hope to see constructive dialogue between all major stakeholders, including Saudi Arabia, Palestine, Egypt, and Jordan. In addition, these webinars will be held with parliamentarians, scholars, business and academic leaders, and of course, religious leaders on the Middle East peace and the Abraham Accords. And this will be done through our UPF associations that are very much like the International Summit Council for World Peace, which the heads of state have joined here today. For the past 20 years, UPF's Middle East Peace Initiative has been actively supporting dialogue between all parties. Dr. Walsh, Had Ben Zvi, Taj Hamad, and I were very fortunate to be a regular part of this ongoing effort to build bridges and friendships for peace in the Middle East. We sincerely thank all of our organizers from Israel, Canada, Europe, the United States, and throughout the Middle East for helping us make this wonderful program, and especially to our technical people here. Special thanks to the Washington Times for its support for this program and for the coverage of the Abraham Accords, which fair and balanced reporting that has been a voice of reason to decision makers not only in America but throughout the world. In the Middle East, in addition to the Middle East, another significant focus of the Universal Peace Federation, co-founded by Dr. Hak Jahan Moon, is on peace and security in Northeast Asia, particularly regarding the longstanding conflict between North and South Korea. We are creating a global working group of experts, of heads of state like yourselves, and also individuals who are experts in intelligence and negotiation and peacemaking. And we would like that global working group to become like a think tank that can work with us on areas where we need focus on dialogue and peace. Many of our UPF affiliates, for instance, represent countries that have diplomatic relations right now with North Korea. And that will help us seek to broaden the dialogue to include the other countries who are part of the six-party talks and many from Europe and around the world. Finally, UPF has initiated the Rallies of Hope, in which heads of government and global opinion makers are giving messages of hope and realistic solutions to how international cooperation can create a better world. And these are broadcast by satellite and been 4 different Rallies of Hope to 175 countries, reaching tens of millions of people. Thank you so much for being with us today, and may God bless you and your families and your nations. Thank you.
Amen. Thank you so much, Dr. Jenkins. And I will add my huge thanks to President Thomas Walsh and the Moon family for allowing this important panel to happen. Thank you as well to our distinguished panelists. You have contributed a great deal to our understanding of the intent and possible outcomes of the implementation of the Abraham Accords. Of course, other perspective needs to be fully heard. The Universal Peace Federation has planned additional webinars like this in the coming weeks that will lay out other perspective on these accords. And finally, thank you, all of you, the participants of this important webinar, for your kind attention. We hope to see you soon all again. From Dubai, I will tell all of you goodbye, shalom, salam.
This has been the Abraham Accords, a step toward peace in the Middle East. Thank you for watching.